All right, AP Environmental Science. Today we are going to continue with our lecture about the Green Revolution. We started this a little bit. I'll introduce you to that term today, Green Revolution. But yesterday we mainly talked about the human diet. As far as what it is that we eat and what it is that we demand. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how we grow our food. In fact, the next couple of lectures will center around this topic of growing food, agriculture, farming, because how we grow it has a really big impact on the planet. So let's start today with this term here, agriculture. When you think about agriculture, you probably think about farming and tractors and growing food and whatever, right? So there's a lot of things that actually kind of um, come into play when we think about this term agriculture. There's growing the food, obviously. So we have to plant it into the ground, grow it. We have to harvest it, which means we have to remove it from the ground. We have to process that food, which could, you know, include a variety of different things. And we have to prepare it. We have to package it, ship it off, transport it too. I guess that's probably something that we should have put in here. I guess that would probably go along with preparing. So there's a lot of things that go into this agricultural process. And if you were in class yesterday, I made this statement. Agriculture has been described as the single most harmful action that has ever taken place. And I'll explain why that is on the next slide. But we have to kind of understand that agriculture has not always been the same. I mean, 10,000 years ago, which is really when the first people started planting things into the ground. The earliest evidence of agricultural processes was about 10,000 years ago. It wasn't like, we were polluting the planet with our agricultural practices. However, it did lead to people living longer, right? I mean, if people can eat healthy food that they plant into the ground, it gives them a little bit of a longer lifespan, and it kind of started, this track of exponential growth that we've been talking about in class for a couple months. It also led to the beginning of the degradation of the environment. Degradation means that basically we're doing damage to the planet through some of the practices of agriculture. Now, again, 10,000 years ago, this was probably on a much smaller scale. But as we got into the 1900s, for example, the 20th century, this is when we really started utilizing fossil fuels to help us farm. Farms became a lot more mechanized, and then the um, degradation of the planet really started to occur, and it's occurring still today. So we'll talk about some of those processes. So again, back to the statement, that agriculture is the worst thing like to ever happen. A lot of our environmental problems are strictly just associated with population size. We just have too many people on this planet, and we're doing a lot of damage. So, I mean, this chart here is kind of showing us this positive feedback loop associated with agriculture and the growing population. So, if you've got a population that's growing, like we have right now, 7.8 billion people and growing, you're going to have to feed them, right? So that's where our agricultural productivity is going to have to go up. And it has gone up. We have increased our output of food. So if we do that, if we produce more food, then we're going to get more people, right? I mean, that's a no-brainer. We just keep, adding fuel to the fire, right? We're adding more and more food to the population to allow people to live. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it has driven this population problem. So the more people you're going to have, the more agriculture we're going to need, the more farming we're going to have to do, which does degrade the planet. And then the population is going to grow more. So it's like this never-ending loop. Um, you know, there are some solutions to this problem. I mean, they sound kind of drastic, but I mean, we can like stop having so many kids, right? We talked about that a little bit. And the other thing too is just to either not make as much food, but that would, cause more starvation around the world, or just produce our food in a much smarter way. And those are some of the things that we'll discuss, in this unit. It's like, what are some ways that we can manufacture or grow food that's not going to harm the planet? So that's I think the big key to this whole thing. All right, so let's take a look at why agriculture is so bad, or at least some of the practices that we are utilizing is so bad. So this is called an energy subsidy. Energy subsidies basically are energy inputs. In order for us to, grow food, we have to utilize energy, both fossil fuel energy, gas and oil, and also human energy. Now, if you go back to 10,000 years ago, our hunter gatherer societies, our ancestors, they weren't really using a bunch of fossil fuels, right? It was mainly just human energy. So our energy subsidies were very low. The energy subsidy is basically how much energy you have to put in, to get 1 calorie of food produced. 1 calorie is not very much, but there's some math involved in this. We're not going to get into that too much, but basically hunter gatherers, only zero point 0.1 calories of energy have to go in to obtain 1 calorie of energy. So basically, there's less energy going in and more energy coming out, which is good. That's kind of what we want. But if you look up here towards the top of this, some of our more modern practices of agriculture, whether it be far offshore fishing or raising cattle or something like that, I mean, these energy subsidies are much higher. So for example, here's an example of an energy subsidy here. If we use 5 calories of energy to produce food, and we only receive 1 calorie of energy when we eat that food, then the food has an energy subsidy of 5. Basically, to make this kind of easy, the lower the energy subsidy, the better it is for the environment. You can kind of see here the typical U.S. diet. Back in 1950, we had an energy subsidy of about 5. 2010, we've doubled that. So we're using more energy to create our food now than we ever have before. Okay, so energy subsidies vary, really depending on the size of the farm. Small scale farms like this picture on the bottom left here, this woman, maybe her family can probably manage, maybe this small, maybe a half of an acre or something of farmland. It probably doesn't require a lot of energy other than manpower. Maybe there's some equipment that she uses, but it probably doesn't require a lot of energy input, as far as fossil fuels go. Whereas the picture on the right here, this is a much larger operation. This is what we see mainly in the United States now. We don't see a lot of small farms like this. We see a lot of larger farms. And that's going to require a tremendous amount of energy, and the energy subsidy is much higher. So, I always tell kids, your food choices are energy choices. If you eat food, let's say from a local farmer's market, where that food didn't have to be transported, across the country in order for you to eat it, it's probably a better energy choice for the environment than, let's say, buying something from a grocery store, or buying something from Target or McDonald's or something that most likely required a lot more energy to produce that food. So food choices are energy choices. Remember that. That's important. All right. Now today, modern techniques, we do utilize a lot of fossil fuels. This is a bad thing for the environment because every time you burn a fossil fuel, it produces greenhouse gas emissions, right? Global warming, amongst other problems that we'll get to later on this semester. So we have to kind of understand what fossil fuels are kind of used for. All right. So one of them is to produce fertilizers and pesticides. So, large scale farming operations in the United States, for example, use a tremendous amount of fertilizer and a tremendous amount of pesticides. So to manufacture those things and to transport those things, and even to apply those things, we utilize a lot of fossil fuels. Operating tractors and other farm machinery obviously utilizes a lot of fossil fuels. Pumping water for irrigation. This is a big problem because a lot of the farms in this country, there isn't water nearby. They have to pump it from, in some cases, under the ground or from some resource that might be miles away, maybe a lake or a river or something like that. But pumping that water, these irrigation pumps require energy. They require fossil fuels to function. So that's a big deal. And then finally, just transporting the food. You know, once it's harvested, they have to transport it from point A to point B. In a lot of cases, that's completely across the country, or in some cases, from one country to another. This is not a joke here. It says an average item sold in a grocery store travels over 1,000 miles before it's even sold to a customer. Imagine that. So, imagine you go to the grocery store, you've got your shopping cart, and in your shopping cart there might be 30 or 40 items. Think about the total mileage, the total transportation mileage that all of those items had to travel just before you purchase them. So it's quite tremendous to think about how many miles are actually utilized in the transportation process. So lots of fossil fuels are used, obviously. All right, so that leads us to this term here, the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is basically a farming ideology. It's this idea that if we're going to feed the world, we're not going to do it utilizing small farming techniques. I'm going to go back to this picture here. If we're going to feed the world, this isn't the way we're going to do it. Okay, there's just no way that we can feed the world with just these small scale farms. So the Green Revolution is a shift. It's a change in methods. From small scale farming to much larger industrial operations that utilize a lot more machinery and a lot less human labor. Okay, this really started to come into existence in the 1900s, especially the middle of the 1900s. The Green Revolution really took off in the United States and also around the world. So, what I guess the good thing about it is, it has allowed us to feed more people. I guess that's a good thing. But the bad thing is, it's allowed us to feed more people. So that's kind of a bad thing. Because again, we feed more people, they're going to overpopulate. So there's sort of some issues there. Um, I do want to kind of clarify something here. A lot of times when you hear the term green, in an environmental science class or just in environmental circles, it has kind of a positive connotation to it. All right. In this case, green does not necessarily mean good. It doesn't necessarily mean it's environmentally friendly. We just call it the Green Revolution, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. Don't think happy thoughts when you think about the Green Revolution because it's not necessarily all good. All right. So what we're going to talk about the next few days is, and we'll do the first two today, and then we'll get into the rest of these a little bit later on. But there's basically 6 different techniques that are utilized in modern day farming techniques. Mechanization, you probably have an idea what that is. Monocropping, GMOs, which are also known as genetically modified organisms, like genetically modified crops, irrigation techniques, fertilization, and pesticides. So we're going to talk about all 6 of these. All right, again, today we'll just cover the first 2. All right, so the first one is mechanization. Again, mechanization is this idea that our farms, if we're going to grow a lot of food, we're going to have to use a lot of farm equipment. You don't really see in the United States farms being run like this. Like a couple of mules and some guy walking behind it with a plow. That those days are pretty much over. Like you'd be pretty hard pressed to find any place in the United States that's operating on this level. Most of our farms again are run with farm equipment again that utilizes um, fossil fuels. So why are we yeah, why have we shifted to more mechanized farms? One, fossil fuels are just really abundant. So I mean they're available and they're also fairly cheap. So I mean for a farmer, it's much cheaper to just go out and buy some gas and put it into a tractor than to pay this dude to walk behind a couple of mules, and he's not going to get nearly as much work done as that tractor would be. So human labor prices are quite high. Finding people to want to work on farms is not cheap. Plus, these farms are extremely large. So again, if you're going to run it with a couple of mules and some guy standing behind them, good luck planting all your seeds and harvesting all of your crops. I mean, it's not going to be done very quickly this way. If it's mechanized, it'll be a lot faster. So the result of this, in developed countries like the U.S., we don't really have that many people who work in agriculture. Less than 5% of our workforce actually works in the agricultural industry. And a big reason why is because of some of the reasons I explained earlier. But probably the biggest thing is that human labor is just so expensive. Again, it's expensive and it's not fast. So, machines are much more, I guess, efficient. Now, in developing countries, where wages are much cheaper. People will work for a lot less money. And also, a lot of these people who own these farms may not be as rich as people in America to go out and buy a lot of this farm equipment. We do see a lot more, labor on some of these farms in developing countries. So it's kind of just kind of an opposite thing. In the developed world, it's much more mechanized. In the developing countries, it's much less mechanized and much more manpower is used on farms in those types of countries. Monocropping. Monocropping is basically a very simple idea. It's just we're just going to plant one type of crop. A lot of farms in the United States, they are either corn farms or they're soybean farms or they're whatever, strawberry farms. It's typically one single species or variety of plant. In the United States, that is the dominant agricultural practices. So there's a term here called the economies of scale. The economies of scale basically says that the larger your farm is, the cheaper it is to run it. And as a result of the economies of scale, most farms in the United States have doubled in size since the 1950s. So in the US, we have a lot of really, really large farms. I'll show you how large they are in a second. But not only are these farms large, but they're also monocrop farms. So, the average farm in the United States, large and single crop. All right. Yeah, you do have some farms where they can grow multiple things, but you got to remember if you grow multiple crops, a lot of times you're going to need different types of equipment. Harvesting corn, for example, you might need different equipment than, let's say, you would if you were going to harvest, I don't know, soybeans or tomatoes or something like that. So that gets more expensive. So if you're running a large farm that's a monocrop farm, it's actually cheaper to do that than to run a multi-crop farm. Okay, so remember that large single crops, that's pretty much the dominant process in the U.S. And this just kind of shows you, that our average farm size has definitely grown over time. In fact, it's gotten to the point. I think this is kind of an astounding number. The average farm size. Now, this is given in hectares. So you might remember a hectare is about the size of a football field, about the size of that. Okay. So the average farm in the United States of America is almost 180 football fields large. That is average. There are, only 4% of the farms in our country are less than 2 hectares. So, I mean, this is a pretty big farm. Okay. and that's kind of the common thing in the U.S. All right, now monocropping, there's the benefits of it. Again, if we're using large machinery, with monocrop farms, these harvests can be collected fairly quickly. So again, you can plant corn, you can harvest it in no time, and make a ton of money. So there's a benefit there of a monocrop farm. Pesticides and fertilizers can be applied quickly. If you've only got one crop, then you probably only need one type of pesticide, you probably only need one type of fertilizer, and that's it. If you have a multi-crop farm, then you might need multiple pesticides, multiple types of fertilizer. But monocropping, it's a lot easier. Now, some of the negatives. This is probably the biggest one, I think. Soil erosion. Because we've got these large farms, we're talking 180 football fields. There's a lot of soil. And I want to go back to our soil profile, right? We've got our topsoil and our subsoil and our bedrock, our parent rock. All of our farming, all of it takes place up here. In the humus and the topsoil. This is where it all the magic happens. Okay. There's where all the organic material is. That's the soil you can plant things in, and that's what we do. But every time you harvest, every time you remove those plants, you turn that topsoil over. And what that does is it allows it to be eroded. It allows it to be carried by the wind or rain or whatever, and we lose a lot of that topsoil. So what ends up happening is we've got subsoil, which is a lot of rock underneath. You can't really plant things in rock. So basically what's happening is because we're farming so much, we're losing a lot of our organic layers of our soil, and that's not a good thing. Crops can be more vulnerable to pests. If you have a monocrop farm, basically, you got 180 acres of corn, for example. If you get one pest, that could decimate your entire crop. So, these pests, if they're not controlled, they can really damage the crop that you're growing and really damage your pocketbook. Because if you're a farmer, you are totally dependent on selling those crops for cash. So pests can be a real big issue. Another big problem is the lack of natural pest predators. If you have a monocrop farm, you only have one type of plant. So, the natural predators for those pests probably aren't going to be there because, those predators, like, other like bigger insects and things like that, they usually live on different types of plants. And if those plants aren't there, then those predators aren't going to be there either. So you're probably going to have to spend a lot of money on pesticides if you are running a monocrop farm. So that's a kind of a big deal. We'll talk about pesticide use in a couple of days. All right, last thing here real quick, I just wanted to show you. I think this is kind of an interesting picture. It just kind of shows us how, our farming has changed over the years. 100 years ago, for example, there was only 12 species of corn, that we would, grow. Only 12 different species, which that might sound like a lot. But today, there are 307 different species of corn. Tomatoes. 100 years ago, there was only about 79 different species of tomato. Now there's 408. Now, the reason why I show this to you is because the next topic that we get into is GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And one of the reasons why we've, for example, gotten to having 408 species of tomato plants is because we've genetically modified the tomato plants to eventually have different species. All right, so we're going to talk about that in the next set of notes, but I'm going to let you guys go for today. That was quite a bit, so make sure you look over this. Take care, everybody.